Akwaba, welcome to Tikyiile Talks. This is a platform where I, Tikyiile, have conversations with people from different walks of life who share their thoughts and pass their story thus far. I hope you enjoy. Okay. So welcome to episode 7 of Tikyiile Talks. Today's guest is Saffy Sall, who's the creator of Dear Brown Girl and a recent law grad. Saffy, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me on.
A pleasure. So the first question is, where's your family from? What's your heritage?
All sorts of my grandparents came to England when they were about 18, 19.
Okay.
They're from a northern state in India called Punjab. Both my parents were born over here. And yeah, my dad's from around Sheffield, so when my mum got married to him, she moved down here, and then I was born and bred in Chesterfield. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. So you're third generation then?
Yes.
Do you know why your family decided to come to England?
I think it was just job opportunities, to be honest. A lot of people in the 60s were coming over from India, and I think at that time it was just seen as something that England had loads of opportunities and jobs going, and that's why I think a lot of grandparents that I know, especially of that sort of generation, did come around that time. So, yeah.
And how do you know how they found it when they came over?
I think it was really difficult. I think they faced a lot of things like racism, and I think acceptance in society, but also getting used to learning the language and stuff like that. And I think that's why you find a lot of communities in places like Slough or Birmingham or Wolverhampton, where that's where the jobs are. So a lot of Punjabi people have always gone there, and I think that that's a place that you do see pockets of that in the country. So I think that my grandparents on my dad's side moved to Sheffield, and there actually weren't that many Punjabi families in Sheffield at the time. Okay. And I think they found it really difficult. And I know that when my grandparents moved to Chesterfield about 40 years ago, I think they were one of the first Asian families in the area. So I definitely think that was a bit of a struggle for them, because it must have been very isolating as well.
Definitely, I can imagine. So I'm guessing you growing up then, what kind of stuff did they tell you to prepare you for such situations?
I think it was strange, because growing up in Chesterfield, it's a very white town.
Right, okay, yeah.
And I think that no one can really prepare you for experiencing that as a child. I think that it's very difficult. And I think that also kids, especially if they maybe haven't interacted with black or brown people before, it's something that maybe... I don't know. I think that I definitely found it difficult, especially growing up and being the only brown kid.
Yeah, so how was that?
In my class? I definitely found it quite difficult. I think at the time maybe I didn't realise, but looking back, I think there were probably little things that had an effect on my life that I didn't even realise. So I definitely think that...
Such as?
I think this sounds so silly, but I would get picked on for having body hair at 11, because my hair was darker than everyone else's.
Right.
And it was something that was seen as oh, you growing a monobrow, or oh, you have a moustache, or little things like that I definitely was singled out for being brown, and maybe not looking like the rest of my peers. Right. So
how do you deal with that as an 11-year-old as well? I
think at the time I didn't really think it was racism or racist. I think maybe I didn't understand actually what it was.
Right.
And I think I grew up thinking that Eurocentric beauty standards were the epitome of beauty. Okay. And I touch upon that a bit on Dear Brown Girl, and I definitely think that's something now that I know that's just stupid to have thought that. But I think when you're growing up in a very white town and all you see in the media or brown people aren't really represented, then you do start to think that way. So I think that as much as, this town is great and it's lovely, I do think that can be very small-minded at times.
Because I know you said something about somebody said to you you're pretty for an Asian girl.
Yeah, I would have that all the time, and I think that it's such a backhanded compliment. It's very much oh, we don't really think brown people are attractive, but you're okay.
Yeah, you've made the cut.
It's fine. Yeah, you've made the cut. So I think that I actually at the time would love receiving these kinds of compliments, because I think I really distanced myself from my heritage and my culture, because I think I was kind of embarrassed about it. I think growing up in a very white town and not being around or in those pockets of big Asian communities, I found it really embarrassing, and I wanted to really distance myself. So I actually stopped speaking Punjabi for years. I just would always answer back in English when family members would speak to me in Punjabi, because it used to make me cringe so much. It sounds so silly, but
Why?
I got embarrassed of it. And I think I didn't have the opportunity to truly appreciate my culture, or growing up with two different cultures side by side. I think I just wanted to fit in with everyone that was white around me. So that meant that I just felt so embarrassed. So when people would compliment me and be like, oh, you're pretty for an Asian, or you don't really act Indian, I'd be like, oh yeah, like I love that. I love receiving these kinds of compliments.
Right.
But that was so silly, and looking back on it, because I just think that I wish that I'd just learnt to appreciate my culture really early on, instead of trying to hide away from it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think you mentioned something about how like you're too Indian for the white people, but also too white for the Indian people.
Yeah.
So where exactly do you then fit in all of that?
Yeah, and I think that actually a lot of brown kids growing up in England will probably, or any other country outside of India, will probably say the same thing. I think it's difficult, especially as a third generation immigrant, because your parents have been born over here, so you have grown up in a very like Western way.
Yeah.
But then you still have the ties, and you'll never be a white person. You have to, I think, appreciate your culture. And I think that definitely, but then on the other side, a lot of people within my grandparents' generation, they still expect you to sometimes act quite traditional. So I think that it's very difficult, because in the way that I might dress or act is seen as very Western to them. But I know that
It's normal.
It's difficult, because you want to appreciate your culture, but you don't want to be tied down by what is, I guess, is the restrictive parts of it, and the way you should act and the way a woman should behave. So I think it's difficult trying to balance it, or trying to find a middle ground where you appreciate it, but you're not trying to forget your Punjabi heritage.
Yeah.
It's really hard, but.
So you said, I'm guessing obviously the older you got, you began to appreciate that more. So like in university, how was that then? Because obviously it's more diverse than where you're from.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with all of that?
I think it was definitely when I got to uni that I started to appreciate my culture and my heritage. I think even in sixth form, again, I think I was the only non-white girl in my year.
Wow.
And I think that really had an effect on me as well. So I think that once I got to uni and I started being around people from other backgrounds, and also joining things like my university feminist society, I think that's when I started to really get into more of these kinds of things, because I'd always been interested in it, and feminism and that kind of thing, but I think that it was difficult for me to really appreciate it at the time. But yeah, definitely when I got to uni.
Because what, you were scared, or you shied away, or
I think
you just didn't know?
Yeah, I think I was just trying so hard to fit in with everyone else at the time that I think I just didn't really want to stand out as much. But then getting to uni and realising it's okay to appreciate your culture and your heritage, and actually embrace it rather than shy away from it, I definitely think that uni was good in that respect.
Yeah, because I'm guessing obviously there are more people like you who are second or third generation, and
Definitely.
so they understood your struggle as such, and you could all, band together.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that that's one thing that you realise, that you get to uni and you meet other people like you, and you start talking about things or experiences within the Asian community, especially with women that I've met at university in terms of restrictive. I think the way that women are supposed to act in South Asian communities is quite imposed on you from an early age. So I'd talk about these things with women that I'd met at university, and it was great because it was like, you kind of live the same life that I do. You had the same experiences, and that was really good. And I think it was definitely quite cathartic in a way to just realise that I'm not alone in the way that I feel.
Right.
So, yeah.
And how was uni in general? Like in terms of everything, in terms of like your studies, your friends, your experience with it?
I actually loved university. I had a great time. It wasn't without its downs or the hard moments, but definitely think that I'm so glad that I went. I made great friends, and I definitely think that if I hadn't gone to uni and hadn't had those experiences, I'm not sure I would have set up Dear Brown Girl.
Right.
And I think that university really gave me the opportunity to get involved in feminist societies and human rights things like Amnesty. So definitely think that it was so beneficial in that respect, and also a lot of fun.
I can imagine. Yeah, definitely. So, because you mentioned that Dear Brown Girl, so what when did that come about? What is that?
So it came about I think it was a few months ago now, in around April time or May.
Okay.
I just set it up in lockdown. I think that it was something that I wanted to do for a really long time. And I had so much time during lockdown. I think everyone had a lot of time to work on this kinds of stuff. And it's just a page I wanted to set up discussing the experiences for South Asian women. So things that are quite taboo in our communities, such as mental health, domestic abuse, but also really celebrating our culture as well. And I know that South Asia has really, really diverse communities and cultures, but it was something that I wanted to speak about. But the receptions have actually been great, and I think that people have been really nice about it, because I think I was nervous about setting it up at the time. But no, I think like everyone's been so great and supportive of it as well. So.
Because I saw we posted about Jasvinder on the page.
Yeah.
I'm guessing she's probably now one of your role models, would you say?
Yes, definitely.
So before we get to her, what would you say, did you have any role models growing up before you reached that stage?
I actually not sure if I'd have any in the media growing up as much, but I would say more my mum.
Right.
She got married quite young. And then my parents got divorced when I was 4. But I hope she doesn't mind me talking about this. But she got cut off from her family for 7 years. They weren't really supportive of the divorce of my dad and things like that. And they're a lot more traditional.
How did she deal with that being like?
It was really hard. It was really, really hard for her. And I think that it probably had an effect on me that I didn't really realise. But I think she had to be strong, because obviously she had a child.
Yeah.
So to me, she's always been my role model, because I think that the way that she dealt with being cut off by her family for so many years and having to navigate life on her own without any support, that's why she's definitely my role model growing up. So
how did you deal with that, the whole divorce?
I mean, it's difficult because when you're so young and your parents separate, I think there's probably a lot of things that you don't process as a child. And I do think sometimes it can come out later down the line in your life. But I think that it was difficult not seeing my mum's family for years, and not really understanding why, because they weren't happy with the way that she was living her life. And I think that it's really difficult for children to understand, especially at the time when I was 4, to know that. And I think that maybe that's why I'm such an advocate for women's rights and things like this, and talking about stuff like on Dear Brown Girl, because you know, like 18 years ago, it was something in the South Asian community that even now still, but back then divorce was seen as something so horrific and one of the worst things that could ever happen in your life, and you were seen as an outcast or even shunned by the rest of the community. And I remember people would always talk about my mum when she left my dad as if she was dead, because she'd left the community, and when you leave, you are gone. Like, people don't contact you, that's it. And people would always talk about her like, oh, she was so beautiful, she was such a good dancer, and I'd be like, she still is. Like, she still is. And I think that it was so bizarre for me to be 4 or 5 years old and people coming up to me at weddings or parties and saying and talking about her as if she was dead.
So, I mean, so how do you deal with that then as a kid? Because it's like, well, I've just seen my mum and I saw her again, so like, what's going on?
She's still the same.
Yeah.
It was hard, but I think that it must have been even harder for her. I think that whilst it's hard on kids, like, they're young and they can adapt quite quickly, but for my mum, her family were her entire life. So I think that it's so hard as well, because South Asian communities can be quite tight-knit, and your family is
so how do you go from
everything.
that tight-knit to completely abandoning them?
Yeah, and I think that maybe that's another reason why I really shied away from my culture, because I just became so disconnected from it.
Right.
That I just didn't want anything to do with it. And
so I'm guessing obviously you didn't see your dad's side either.
I still see my dad and stuff, which is great. Like, I'm really close to my dad's family, so that's good. They're still in Chesterfield and stuff like that. So.
But before, when you were younger, did you see them?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I've always been really close to my dad's family, which is nice.
That's good.
But it's definitely more my mum's that they're a lot more traditional, and they have quite backwards views sometimes if they watch this. Yeah, and I think that is one of the reasons as well that I set up Dear Brown Girl, because of the experiences that I know that my mum has had, but also so many women in the South Asian communities when they get divorced or they live a life that they want to and they do get shunned by the community. I think that that's another reason that it's so important for me to like speak out about these issues if I have the platform to do so. Yeah.
Because Jasmina that you mentioned on your page, she's been doing that. Can you tell a story for us?
Yeah. So she is from Derby, I believe, and she set up Karma Nirvana, a charity helping women of South Asian descent with honour-based abuse or forced marriages. And I think she's got like an OBE or something from the royal family. Wow. I don't know what it is. She's got some very good awards. But basically she set up the charity because her sister, well, Jasvinda herself was...
She ran away from her husband or something?
Pardon?
Was it a sister who ran away from her husband?
Yeah, so Jasvinda ran away from home, and she's Punjabi like myself, and she was going to have a forced marriage, but she ran away from home. But she talks about in her book that all of her siblings had arranged marriages or forced marriages, really, and one of her sisters continuously tried to leave her husband, but each time she was always forced back to return to him, and then her sister actually set herself on fire to free herself. Yeah, to free herself. But I think obviously her mental health had got so bad and it deteriorated so much that was the only situation that she felt like she was in. And from then, Jasvinda set up the charity to help women like her sister, and herself in South Asian communities. So yeah, what would you say?
Yeah, definitely. What would you say the difference is between forced marriage and arranged marriage?
So I think it's difficult because I think a lot of people maybe think that the lines are blurred, but arranged marriage is when maybe your family gets involved or a matchmaker to find your husband or a wife, whereas a forced marriage, it's very much that you don't have a say in anything. You are expected to get married, and the situation really can be quite awful. And I know that whilst it's illegal in the UK, I don't think there's been that many convictions of people who've been involved in forced marriages. So it's quite difficult because these things probably happen all the time, but because they're not really spoken about as much, it's very difficult for that to be convictions for it. So yeah.
So because I'm guessing you probably might know some people who've had like forced and arranged marriage. Like how would you say they've dealt with their own situation?
It's difficult because it's very much a thing in the South Asian community that definitely more so back in the day, not as much now, but in terms of it's still alive at the moment, but it's something that you're expected to do. It's all about you protecting your family's honour and protecting the image of the family. So you can't say no because it's very much a blackmail thing as well. Yeah, you're guilted into it because it's seen as a very much you do this for your family, and if you don't, then there'll be consequences.
Yeah, because you mentioned like the izzat, isn't it? Yeah, like obviously it's the honour of your family and whatnot. Yeah. How prevalent do you think that is to this day?
I definitely think it's still prevalent. I think that, unfortunately, whilst it would be good to say those kinds of things don't happen in the South Asian community, they definitely still do. And I think that that's one thing that I think especially on girls, it's very much that they carry the family's honour. And if you don't get married or you don't do this or you don't act a certain way, then you'll bring shame on the family.
Right.
And I think it's really hard because it is resting so much on the women in the family, whereas men are treated very differently in South Asian communities. And it's really hard. It's really hard to deal with. And women are treated and held to a very, very different standard to men.
Wow. Yeah. Like, can you give examples? What different standards would you say?
So in terms of the way that women should act, it's very much that they maybe should be traditional and not speak out, or shouldn't wear too much makeup, shouldn't wear revealing clothes, whereas men have pretty much been allowed to do freedom to do anything. And I think that I've always found that very difficult to deal with, and I've always questioned it. But it happens so much in like South Asian communities. I think that it's really difficult, and it's frustrating because I just think that especially in 2020, and people are starting to speak out about social issues a lot more and become involved in feminism. And I think that it's difficult, especially for me to deal with as a third generation immigrant, that these things that have maybe been carried over from India and brought over are still here. Yeah.
So would you say, I'm guessing you wouldn't say you want a forced or arranged marriage?
No, I think that a lot of people in my generation have started to really find their own path and have like interracial marriages or that kind of thing. And I think that it's something to me that I've seen so many women in my family that have maybe had forced marriages that I would just never have wanted to go down that line myself, or even have an arranged marriage. I think that I'd rather much not marry at all rather than have someone sort it out for me.
Wow.
Yeah.
But so I'm guessing you want to find your own husband and whatnot. And I'm guessing is there a restriction? Like, would you say you just want to marry like an Asian person, or you're happy to just see what happens?
I think you've just got to see what happens. I think you can't really tie yourself down to an ideal, I guess, of wanting to find someone. I think that a lot of people will just go for it to marry someone within the Punjabi community that I know of, and then they're not exactly happy. They're probably just doing it because their family have expected them to do so. So I think it's difficult because a lot of people just end up really unhappy, but they just think, well, this is what's expected of me, so I should just do it because I'm doing it for my family as well. But I just think it just makes people unhappy, so I would never want to put myself in that situation.
So let's say, I don't know, next year you bring someone home, it's not Punjab, maybe a black, white guy, whatever, and you say, Mum, Dad, this is who I want to marry. And what do you think their reaction would be in terms of them personally and also like your extended family?
My mum would definitely be fine with whoever I end up with. I think I haven't really thought about it too much with any other family member because it's definitely something that I'll cross the bridge when I get to it. But I do know that it's sometimes seen as quite shocking if you marry outside of the community and you marry someone who's not Punjabi. But I think that it's something that I'm going to have to deal with when I get to it. I mean, I can't predict how family members are going to act, but at the end of the day, that's what I try and talk about in Dear Bragan and stuff, is that as much as you can love your family and want to support them and that sort of thing, it is your life at the end of the day. And I know that it's very easy for me to say that growing up as a third generation immigrant and having gone to university and moved away from home. And I know that some women don't have the same privileges that I've had. But I definitely think that if I can try and live my own life and maybe show other women in the South Asian community that you don't have to follow the path that your family have set for you, then definitely that's something that I'd try.
I'm going to assume that you show your family and some of them aren't happy with that. I'm guessing you're still going to go through with the marriage regardless.
I don't know. I don't know how it would go or what I'd be in the situation of.
I'm just thinking, because obviously it's weird because your community who's meant to support you regardless. Yeah. And if you have a divorce and then distance you, which is questionable for a so-called community. Yeah. And now you're then trying to bring somebody new into the community. Surely the community should be welcoming towards that person. Yeah. But obviously, if they want like their own kind of person for that, then is that really a community? Would you say?
No, I think that the South Asian community is so hypocritical. That's one thing I would definitely say.
Right.
And I think it's really hard because it's a community, but you're very much dictated by what the community want for you or what your family really want for you. So I think that there's so many ideals imposed on women and the way that they have to act. And it's really hard because men can get away with so much more. So I think that whilst I'd hope that people in the community would be supportive, I know that won't be the case with everyone. And I've seen that firsthand when I know of people who have married outside the community. So I think that it's definitely something that I know I'll probably have to deal with when I get to it.
Would you say it's more of a culture issue or a religious issue?
It's culture, yeah. I think that's another thing that people maybe get confused about is religion and culture. Because my family are Sikhs, so Sikhism is actually quite a peaceful religion, I would say, very much accepting of everyone. It says on the first page of our holy book, I think, I might be wrong on this, but it says in there that men and women are equal, and that regardless of sex, class, race, that kind of thing, everyone should be treated the same. But unfortunately, Punjabi culture is very patriarchal, and it has a lot of ideals that are imposed on women on the way they should act, unfortunately. So I think that while Sikhism is a great religion, I think unfortunately Punjabi culture tends to dominate that, especially over here in Punjabi communities.
Right.
Yeah.
And also in terms of people's mental health, like how do they then deal with that? Because obviously if the community aren't really open about it, because I think you mentioned that there's not even a word for mental health in some languages, so like how do people talk about it if they talk about it?
Yeah, there's no real words for like depression or those kinds of terms in Punjabi, not that I actually know of. And I think that mental health is seen as such a taboo, especially. So when you're imposing all these ideals upon people in the community to get married, because I should emphasize as well that it's not just women who get like forced into marriages, it can be men as well. So when you impose these things on children from a very young age, I think it's very difficult because mental health isn't talked about in our community. And I think that this is another thing that really frustrates me as well, because you have so many people growing up that maybe need to access mental health services, but it's seen as something quite embarrassing. It's seen as something that you've gone crazy if you're suffering with depression or anxiety or that kind of thing. So I think it is really hard for some people in the community, and I especially think the older generations that came over here with no support, can speak the language, grew up with all these issues, and maybe might have inflicted some of that on their children. I think it's really difficult for them as well. Yeah, and I think that if you don't speak out about things, it's very difficult to get the help that you need. So that's definitely one thing that I have spoken about in Dear Brown Girl, because it's such an issue within South Asian communities.
So I'm guessing, so let's say you have you're going through something, like you might go into depression. How would you personally deal with it now?